came back, he besieged it and then squashed it, crushed it, burned it, and took that temple apart stone by stone so there wasn't.
What 80% of my family was. 120 human beings who had perished in these camps. Well, the war is over. My father comes home, and we try to pick up some semblance of normalcy. I got sent to school. I got put in the first grade, but I had a problem. I did not know how to associate with other children. I had spent 18 months of my life in that apartment. So when a child said something to me I didn't like, I either hit or I bit. Well, got over that. In 1947, Romania became a communist dictatorship. My father owned 2 men's shirt factories, and one morning the government came to him and said, the factories you own have now been nationalized. You will still run them, but you will no longer own them. Well, I told you my mother was stubborn. My father was not to be outdone. He arranged for my mother and I to escape across 2 borders. We went from Romania into Hungary, Hungary into Austria. When we got to the Romanian-Hungarian border, and the people who knew where the gaps in the barbed wire were, and when it was a good night to cross, saw that I was an 8-year-old boy, they panicked. They were afraid I would make a noise and give them away. So in addition to whatever money my father had paid them, and there was nothing wrong with that because they risked their lives to do this, my mother took off the jewelry she was wearing and gave it to them, so they decided it was okay to take the chance. To this day, I still remember the sounds of the guards, the smell of their cigarette smoke, and the barking of the dogs. As we were walking across the fields in Hungary, my mother stepped into a pothole and severely sprained her ankle. So when we got to Budapest, we had to go to what was called a safe house, and I was right back in the apartment. Don't make any noise, don't draw attention to yourself, don't speak to anyone. Within a 3 to 4 week period, my mother's ankle healed. We went to the Hungarian-Austrian border, crossed over, and just as we were getting ready to board a bus to go into Vienna, we were arrested by the Austrian police. Luckily, it was the Austrians, because if it would have been the Russians, we would have been sent straight back to Bucharest. When they explained to them that we were so-called political refugees, they put us on a bus and sent us into Vienna. My parents had arranged for a telephone conversation, and when my mother said a certain key word to my father, he knew that we were safe in Vienna. He had gotten a hold of some explosives. He planted them on a timer. He went across the border. And in the morning when the Romanians went to look for their factories, all they found was rubble. He had blown them up. Every once in a while, almost on a daily basis, my wife looks at me and says, "You're so doggone stubborn." And I said, "Yes, I am. I get it legitimately. I come from 2 very stubborn people." Well, here we are in Austria of the late 40s and 50s. Austria was also an interesting country. For years, she claimed that she was an occupied nation. Well, Adolf Hitler, ladies and gentlemen, was not German. He was Austrian. When they had the Anschluss, when they took over Austria, they were welcomed with open arms. But it's come out that Austrian Jews had to pay what was called a flight tax. They had to pay for their own deportation. And one of the most notorious of the extermination camps was outside of Linz, Austria, known as Mauthausen. So much for the myth that Austria was a conquered nation. When we got there, they told us it would be at least 3 to 5 years before we could even think about coming to the United States. So they had to issue you what is called an identity card. This was issued to me, and as much as I speak, you think I would know it by now. The 4th day of the 10th month of the 50th year. I was 10 years old. It's in 4 languages. It's in German, English, French, and the bottom part is Russian. And every time I show it, it amazes me that it says this is an identity card for foreigners and stateless persons. That's what I had to become. It's a terrible thing for a 10-year-old boy to be either a foreigner or a stateless person. And by the way, they just didn't give this to us. Whatever meager funds we had, you had to pay for it. So if the police stopped you, you produced your identity card. I had your picture inside. Cute kid one night, had hair and everything. Amazing. So this was
I think
Vienna.
it's so cool you still have it. How did you know?
My mother was, shall we say, a hoarder. Okay?
Aren't you think?
She didn't throw a lot of things away. As I said, when we got there, they told us it would be at least 3 to 5 years before we could even come to the United States. My father had 2 brothers who had gone to France prior to the Second World War. As liberal as Romania was, when my Uncle Janos wanted to go to medical school, he was declined. They had a quota, it would only take so many Jews, so he went to Paris and got his medical degree from the University of Sorbonne. He had sent for one of his younger brothers, and during the Second World War, both my uncles were with the French resistance. My Uncle Emery was such a fierce fighter, he hated the Nazis so much that at the end of the war, he was decorated for bravery by Charles de Gaulle. It was a lot easier to get to France from Austria than to come to the United States. My parents decided that my father would go join his brothers, and whoever was able to support the other one would eventually join them. Well, I wound up not seeing my father again for 13 years. In March of 1951, my mother and I got permission to come to the United States. We left Vienna and went to Bremenhaven, Germany, where the ships sailed from. But they only sailed like 1 a week. So I wound up in what was called a displaced persons camp. It was an old German army camp. I don't know if they didn't want us to associate with the Germans associate with us. But for the first time in my life, I was behind barbed wire. August the 7th, 1951, my mother and I boarded a very small former troop ship. And an interesting thing happened. The ship had 2 sections. It had a man's section and it had a woman's section. And since I was a pretty big kid at 11, they didn't think I belonged in with the women, so they put me in with the men. At first it was very traumatic. It was the first time in my life I was separated from my mother. But then I discovered that food was plentiful aboard ship. I could eat as much as I wanted to, when I wanted to. And since my mother spent the 10 days it took to cross in her bunk because she was terribly seasick, I had my first taste of freedom. I roamed the ship. Had very low railings. I was almost hanging over the side. They were afraid I was going to fall overboard. But it was my first taste of freedom. We landed in New York City August the 17th, 1951. Well, the law in New York is that the day after Labor Day, you have to start school. I got put in the 6th grade, but I had a problem. I didn't speak any English. I spoke 4 other languages, but English was not one of them. They didn't have help for foreign students in those days. If you kept up, fine. If you didn't, the teacher really didn't have time to occupy himself or herself with you because there were 50 kids in my homeroom class alone. Luckily, I have a very good ear for languages, so within an 8th month to a 1-year period, I had a working knowledge of English. I had an accent you could cut with a knife, but I had a working knowledge of English. Now, I'm not condoning the next part of my speech, nor am I apologizing for it. It's just the way things happened. The neighborhood I grew up in New York was not the very best. I learned how to defend myself very early and very well. When I felt like going to school, I did. When I didn't feel like going to school, I didn't.